All right. Welcome everyone to this episode of Warriors. This is not Warriors Whiteboard Wednesday. What the hell is it? It's KUDEN. That's what it is. I've been gone for too long. Anyway, so I'll try to keep myself straight for the. What if the biggest obstacle in your training isn't lack of knowledge, right? What if it isn't talent? What if it isn't age or strength or flexibility or even time, right? What if the thing, right, limiting your progress is something you don't even recognize, right? Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, most people say Goth. Anyway, eh, famous dude, right, is often credited with saying, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they're free. Now, think about that for a moment. The most dangerous prison is not the one you can see, it's the one you mistake for freedom, right? A technique you think you understand, a rank you think you've grown into, if any of us actually believe that, a habit that served you, a belief you never questioned, a strength you've become dependent upon, right? A certainty you've stopped examining or exploring. All right. So tonight, during this episode, I'd like to explore some of the hidden prisons that exist within martial arts training and perhaps even within life itself. Because one of the strong lessons reinforced during my recent trip to Japan wasn't about learning something new. It was that still needed to be let go of. Right. So stay with me as we get into this week's topic, and I will see you as soon as we get back.
So, the big question is this: how are self-defense and success-minded people like us, concerned citizens worried about protecting ourselves, our loved ones, and the things we care about from the monsters we know exist in the world? How do we train in a way that gives us the skills, knowledge, and understanding we need without becoming paranoid fighters or killers ourselves, and yet still allows us to be the hero protector the world needs us to be? That's the question, and this podcast will give you the answers. My name is Jeffrey Miller, and welcome to KUDEN Radio. Real training for real people in a real world.
All right. Welcome back. Welcome back to me, right? Where the hell have you guys? Anyway, all right. So this is officially our first episode. I'd say in about 3 weeks, but I did record episode 308, the third part of our three-part mini series on Kazushi. Bless you. Kazushi, right? Balance breaking. That's the way most people see it. While I was there. So if you caught that, great. If not, why the hell not? Anyway, so again, welcome back to KUDEN Radio, the podcast for warrior protectors, martial artists, Ninpo practitioners, and those seeking greater freedom, capability, and mastery in an ever-increasingly uncertain world. All right. So for those of you who know me, great. If not, I'm your host, Dai-Shihan Jeffrey Miller, founder of Warrior Concepts International, director and master instructor of the Bujinkan Mori no Tora Dojo and the Online Ninja Academy. With me, as always, is my ninja in the background, managing the technical stuff and providing a voice to those of you who comment with questions and insights along the way, and who filter out those who would hijack things for whatever their fucking own personal dumbass reasons are. Anyway, Sensei James Alexander. Yay, James. Anyway, I'm in a rare mood. Anyway, tonight, during this episode, I would like to share some observations from my recent training trip to Japan. Okay. But let's be clear, right? This is not simply about techniques. It's not simply about kata, right? It's not even about specific lessons taught by the Japanese master teachers, right? I'm going to cover a lot of that here in about 2 weeks. I guess it is 2 weeks in the upcoming spring camp intensive that we do, right? Uh, so if anybody caught that, great. If you're signed up for it, great. Right? If not, again, why the hell not? Anyway, so what I want to discuss during this episode is something deeper, right? Something that I believe sits beneath all of those things, right? Techniques, kata, specific lessons, whatever, right? And what I'm talking about, and this has actually become the updated theme for spring camp, right? Or if for those of you who've been following along, you probably remember that the original theme was Japan recap, because every time I go to Japan, I come back within a couple of weeks, I do a Japan recap seminar to share some of the lessons that I picked up during that trip. And also, in all honesty, to do a data dump out of my own brain to kind of reconnect some of those things that got a limbo when my brain locked up from all the training. But anyway, the updated theme, right, is the evolution of training, right? So that's the thing, right? So I believe that this sits beneath all these things, right? And it's something that we've got to get our head wrapped around, right? And that's the evolution of training itself. Okay. Because after more than 4 decades in this art, right? And after, again, another trip to Japan, training with some of the most senior teachers in the world, right? Some Soke, some Dai-Shihan, right? I found myself once again reminded of a lesson that many students miss entirely, right? And that is that real progress is not simply about learning more, right? Often it's about becoming free from things, right? Free from dependence, free from attachment, free from fear, from unnecessary effort, from limitations we didn't even realize we were carrying, right? And perhaps that's why a quote by the author Robert Greene struck me so strongly during the tail end of my trip. I was obviously, trying to keep up with things and whatnot, and this kind of popped up, and just it hit home because of the lessons and what we were doing and whatnot. Anyway, Robert Greene says, your fears are a kind of prison that confines you within a limited range of action. The less you fear, the more power you will have, and the more fully you will live. Okay. For those of you who don't know who I'm talking about, Robert Greene is the author of several books that I highly, highly recommend, including The 48 Laws of Power. That should be top of the list, right? His book, Mastery. That's it. The title, Mastery, right? And The Art of Seduction, which is about more than most people would think, given the title, right? And several others, right? He's written a bunch of books. This quote specifically is from his book called The 50th Law, which he actually co-wrote with the artist Curtis Jackson. If you know what I'm talking about, Curtis Jackson, aka 50 Cent, right? This book focused entirely on the concept of fearlessness. Okay. Anyway, before we go on though, James, who's on? Who should I say hi to? Well, don't tell me who I should ignore. That's don't do that. Anyway, who's on? Who's checked in? Yeah,
Looks like Terrence, Carl, Kyle, Dave, Alyssa, Maury.
It's like they missed me. Man.
I don't see Alan though, so he must have had enough.
Yeah, I probably wore him out. He's probably still recovering from jet lag and sleeping. Okay.
He's still in his chair.
Well, I don't know, man. This time around, holy cow, I had a hell of a time getting over jet lag, and usually I can neutralize that pretty well. But as Trinity, well, Alan and Kyle will be able to attest, our flight back, there was, within our section, front row within our section, there was a family that had a 1-year-old, maybe, who screamed. I mean, like screeching screamed a good part of the trip. And so where I would normally have like regulated when I slept and for how long and whatnot, sleeping was the only way to make the screaming go away. And so I did myself more harm than good, but yeah, that was the adventure. So anyway, but yeah, I was just talking to Kyle on Friday, this past Friday, and he was still adjusting. Hopefully he's gotten over things. Trinity probably won't be on. Trinity did our little trip there, and then she was home for 4 days, and then over the weekend she was traveling to Georgia. She presents at a conference there. Well, today was day one, so I don't know exactly which day. She's there for 3 or 4 days, and then she'll be back to the dojo. I think she said 2, so it won't be this week. It'll be the week after that. She'll be back in training. So hopefully she's recovered from things, because otherwise that'd be terrible. Anyway, so cool. Anybody else?
I don't see anybody.
Okay, right. Well, now I'm going to jump right into right back into things. So again, for those of you just joining us, the quote by Robert Greene that I have been referencing is, again, your fears are a kind of prison that confines you within a limited range of action. The less you fear, the more power you will have, and the more fully you will live. And for reference, that's from his book, The 50th Law, that he co-wrote with 50 Cent. I think that's the correct way to pronounce it. You know, I'm a white guy. I would just say 50 cents, but apparently that's not right. Anyway, let's talk about this quote for a bit, right? Because at first glance, that sounds like a quote about confidence or courage or just overcoming fear. But I think it's pointing to something much deeper. Yeah. So if we think about it, right, what do you think of when you think of a prison, quote unquote, a prison, right? Other than being a criminal and it being where you go when you're being incarcerated, right? Other than that definition, right? What do you think of? And for a lot of people, brain kind of locks up. Okay. But if we think about the concept and not just the structure, right? A prison, a cage, anything like that, right, is anything that limits freedom, right? When somebody gets locked away, right, they've lost their freedom. Okay. But it's also anything that narrows or reduces options, right? Could also be anything that restricts perception, right? Anything that prevents growth. And as I've been focusing on since the new year, for those of you who are my regulars, right, since episode 300. And as we've been exploring the Okuden levels of training and development, and as I reflected on these new lessons, right, from Japan, I began realizing that many of the greatest obstacles in training aren't physical at all. Okay? It kind of reminds me of another quote, usually attributed to a guy named Goethe, Johann von. Most people would pronounce it Goth or Goth or something like that because of the way it's spelled, but it's in German, it's actually pronounced Goethe. I lived there for 3 years. Anyway, so, but anyway, this quote that I'm reminded of is, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they're free. Right? So these obstacles that I've been talking about, right? These obstacles are prisons, right? They're hidden prisons. Often they're self-imposed. Okay? And so during this episode, I'd like to explore some of them because I think they hold the key to understanding not only where your training is today, currently, but where it could go next. All right. So again, before I jump into that, James, anybody else jump on? I don't want to ignore anybody. Any comments up to this point?
Alan's on. He says his
Awesome.
ears are still echoing from the screaming.
Yeah, right there with you, brother. So, I'm assuming there's no sound problems or anything like that. We're good.
Sounds good on my end. Nobody's said anything otherwise.
Okay, cool. All right. So, as I said, when most people hear the word prison, they think of walls, right? In Alan's case, they might even think about where they used to work, right? But again, they think of walls, right? They think of bars, chains, confinement, that kind of thing, right? But many of the most powerful prisons have no visible walls at all. Okay? I'm talking about fears, right? Fear of failure, fear of embarrassment, fear of looking foolish, fear of discovering that we're not as capable as we had hoped for, or not as capable as we thought we were, right? Fear of becoming a beginner again, right? And here's the interesting thing. Many of these fears don't disappear as students advance, okay? In some ways, they actually become stronger because now the student has more invested, right? More identity, more expectations, more reputation, right? More certainty about what they believe they know, right? So I mentioned before, but I don't know, a couple episodes maybe, but I'm pretty sure I just mentioned this just recently. But again, just recently was at least 3 weeks ago, right? About that story of the Shihan who talked to me before my Godan test, right? I was at the Atlanta Taikai a couple of weeks ago, 2000. I'd been holding this thing off for a long, long time. And anyway, come up to me after training and, was reassuring me that I would do well, all that kind of stuff, right? And had my anxiety and nervousness and all that kind of stuff going on because my teacher was literally forcing me to take the test. But during this conversation, right, he said that I would do better than most of the current 10th dans if they had to take the test again, right? Of course, he was alluding to, they would fail because of reputation, identity, whatever, right? they'd have some or all of the fears I just listed, and that's why they'd fail the test, right? Because they'd be worried more about that than, that would be clouding the abilities, right? Because the mind would be all tied up with the, what if I fail? What will people say? Right? I'm a 10th on. I can't, right? But they probably haven't worked on the skills to pass the test. They haven't honed them to make them better since they passed the test, right? And this is where I think many practitioners unknowingly become trapped, right? And again, not by lack of knowledge, right? They know tons of techniques. They know tons of skills, right? So it's not lack of knowledge, right? I think it's attachment to what they already know, right? I caught myself a couple of times in Japan. I was in a class and somebody would show a different way to get into a given technique. And Onikodaki was one of them, right? And the shoulder didn't get moved to where I knew it should, right? It was actually in a compressed version that I've always seen and taught that got to be careful. He'll be able to clock you, but he can't, because when we're entering, and for those of you who will be at spring camp, I'm going to show you this version. Because of the way we entered, we already have his other arm tied up. So no, he can't attack us, right? And we're still locking the assembly, the shoulder arm assembly, so person will be taken down. Now, will he go out as a part of the primary movement? No, but I caught myself getting stuck on that's not, and then I had to remind myself to shut the hell up and pay attention to the lesson, so you might learn something, right? So anyway, not on a pedestal, talking about everybody should. No. I'm working on this stuff myself. Okay, so but anyway, there's this attachment, right, to what we already know or we think we already know. Okay, and one of the themes that kept appearing, to me at least, right, during this trip was the idea that advanced training often feels less like accumulating knowledge, less like adding more stuff, and more like letting go of dependency, right? Dependency on strength, dependency on speed, dependency on youth, which I've long since already dropped, right? Dependency on athleticism, right? I just mentioned this one, right? Dependency on fixed forms, right? On certainty, on a fixed or set identity. Okay? In other words, the evolution of training is often a process of becoming free. This doesn't mean you do whatever the hell you want, right? What I'm talking about is letting go of things rather than continuing to accumulate things, right? Letting go of unnecessary movement, letting go of assumptions. There's a whole bunch of things, right? And I keep talking about this concept of freedom, but you know what? Freedom's uncomfortable. Counterintuitive, I know, right? But why is that true? Why is that so? Okay. It's because freedom usually requires giving up something that we've been relying on, right? Maybe without even knowing it. Yes. Okay. So again, I'm throwing a bunch of quotes around, but another writer and author, Aldous Huxley, right? And he wrote one of his most famous books. It's called A Brave New World, right? He's quoted as saying, "The victim of mind manipulation does not know he's a victim, right? To him, the walls of his prison are invisible, and he believes himself to be free." Okay? And just as a reminder, just to be clear, that can even include our manipulation of our own thoughts and beliefs as well. Okay. Nothing sucks more than to realize that not only do we hold the key to the lock, but we have to unlock a freaking, unlock a shackle or a lock or whatever that we put on ourselves to begin with. Okay? And I know, that doesn't cover you guys because we're all enlightened. But yeah. Anyway, so and that's why I think advanced training can feel frustrating, right? That's why it can feel destabilizing, right? That's why sometimes a black belt can feel more uncomfortable in class or with a certain technique or exercise or drill than a beginner. Okay? Think about that. The beginner expects to not know. The advanced student often expects confirmation that he or she does, in fact, know. Right? That distinction is important. Okay? Because authentic growth doesn't always validate us or what we think we know. Okay? Sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes it exposes us, or it exposes our lacks or our shelving certain things because they made us feel uncomfortable. We'd get to them someday, and then here's that someday where we're expected to have it, not up here, not in our head, but integrated into our body. This new version, this new technique, this advanced level kind of thing is making this assumption that you already have it. And it's not there. Okay. And so sometimes, right, it reveals, we'll call them hidden dependencies, right? Like the uke complying. So our technique always works, right? Sometimes it shows us where we've stopped growing, where we've stopped learning, where we've stopped investigating. I'll talk about that here in a bit. As it relates to the senior master teachers. All right. You know what? Yeah. So we'll talk about something related here, but that's exactly where I want to go next. Okay. Because one of the strongest lessons reinforced during this trip actually showed up not in Japan. It showed up back home during a Shinobi Kai class when I was teaching one of those advanced lessons about a technique every intermediate and upper level student knows. Right? I was teaching Muto-Dori, but I was teaching it one-handed with no conventional movement. Like my body was moving, but there were no steps. Not in the actual application. In the follow-up, yeah, because you got to ride the body off. But and we did it with lots of resistance from the uke. No compliance. Okay. They could lock up as much as they wanted. And this Muto-Dori, this armbar, it slipped on easily. Right. And what happened in that class illustrates something every serious practitioner eventually encounters at some point, right? And that is the collision, right, between identity, right, what we believe we are, what we believe we know, who we believe we are, and reality. Okay. So, yeah, James, any comments or anything like that pop up so far? Okay. while you're looking, just a quick reminder before we continue, do me and everyone else who could benefit from these things a favor, right? Like, share, subscribe, you know the deal, right? Help me influence the algorithms, right? We'll ninja these things, right? On whatever platform you're on, right? Whatever one you're using to help me get these lessons out to those who can benefit from them. So anyway, James, any comments or anything pop up for anybody?
No, nothing yet.
Okay. All right. So, um, little, I call this a little, it's not a legal statement, but before I continue, I want to make something very clear, right? Everything I'm about to discuss is something I've experienced myself. Okay. This is not a lesson about those people, right? This is a lesson about all of us, right? We're all human. Okay. It's about all of us because if you've trained long enough, you've been there, right? Or you've been here. I don't know, right? I've been here. Every serious student has been here, right? And honestly, some of the strongest lessons from this recent trip, right, reminded me that I'm still there in certain areas. Okay. So we need to be careful, right? Because the moment we think we've escaped this trap completely, we're probably standing in it, right? We're probably right in the thick of it. And that's a hard pill to swallow. It's a hard pill to swallow, right? But either way, right? Let's get back to this class, right? A few days after returning from Japan, as a matter of fact, we got in, what the hell was it, guys? We got in Sunday night? Yeah, Sunday night, 11 p.m. And apparently since COVID, the rental car companies decided that they would close the rental counters, right? Their business operations at John F. Kennedy Airport, one of the biggest fucking airports in the, anyway, at midnight. And then they wouldn't reopen until 5 in the morning. So we got in at 11. Well, we got in actually early, right? But they put us down, I think, in the wrong runway. And so it took us damn near like 45 minutes to taxi across the freaking airport to the right gate. Otherwise, we'd have been there earlier. But anyway, we're off the plane by about 11. And then, I had to get our luggage. I had to go through customs and immigration, all that kind of shit. So either way, it was after midnight. So we had to camp out at JFK Airport until they opened up the damn counter in the morning and we could drive home. So got home Monday morning. So the next day, right? Next evening. So I'm teaching a Shinobi Kai class, right? And again, we're working on Muto-Dori, right? It's one of the Kihon. Right? Nothing unusual here, right? Like I said, every intermediate and advanced level student should know it, right? Most students are certainly familiar with the basic form, right? They're familiar with the version they've practiced for years, the version they've seen demonstrated how many times, right? The version many have taught to their own students, right? But this time, we approached it from a different perspective. Right? Wasn't through the, as people like to use the word, traditional, right? It wasn't through the standard deep kamae-based two-handed leverage model, right? Not through force, not through muscular control, not through making the technique work, right? Instead, we approached it from the perspective of relationship. And I don't mean like he and I were, friends or whatever, right? I'm talking about balance, direction, structure, right? The same lessons I'd been observing repeatedly, right? During training in Japan. Okay. Very little effort, right? no force to speak of. As a matter of fact, in the one class where we were working on this, the teacher came over and put his finger on the center of my bicep muscle so he could detect if I actually fired it, because the point was to do it without firing the bicep to do the work, right? Yeah, very little, not very little. There was like supposed to be no struggle. The better able we were to direct the humerus, right, into the shoulder socket, to not just move them backwards, but to also create some rotation on the torso, which changes structure, changes balance, changes all those things, right? It should be a matter of zip and it's on, right? So again, I guess the way I would describe it now is the armbar simply appeared, right? Because the conditions supporting the ukes or the attacker's structure were removed, right? They were removed in a way that if you didn't know what to look for, what to feel for, right, you would never know were happening. Okay? Anyway, so during this practice, something interesting, something fascinating happened, right? I think almost everybody struggled, right? Several more than others, right? Including black belts, okay? Including black belts and including a Shidoshi level student, okay? And again, this is not about knocking on anybody that was struggling or whatever. This was very nuanced stuff because, as I said before, we increased the amount of strength and resistance that the uke was using. So much so that they could lock their arm down. Okay. And it doesn't matter. Okay? When done properly, it doesn't matter. Okay? Because it'll go on. Because the things that allow, the elements that allow somebody to be strong, that allow somebody to resist, to allow that resistance or strength to actually matter, were removed with the first move. Okay. And again, before anybody misunderstands me, right? The struggle itself wasn't the lesson. Okay. The frustration was. Okay. And I'm talking about the Shidoshi level student. Okay. Because this is where a statement was made. Okay. With enough time, somebody can figure out a technique, right? With the right questions, with the right exploration, the right level of mindfulness and investigation, right? Anybody can figure out how something works physically. So for this student, the struggle wasn't the lesson. The lesson wasn't the lesson. The technique wasn't the lesson. As a matter of fact, I think next week's episode is on this concept. But either way, right? The frustration was the lesson. Because at one point, in genuine frustration, I mean, like, voice a little shaky, okay? The student said to me, I should be able to do this. Okay. And the moment he said that, I realized something. In that moment, I realized he was no longer talking about Muto-Dori. Okay. The technique had become a mirror. Think about that statement. I should be able to do this. Not, what am I missing? Right? Not, can you show me that angle again? Right? He asked those two questions earlier. Okay? And he was genuinely trying to work it out. Okay? Um, he didn't ask, or he didn't say, I don't understand the balance change. Instead, at this point in that growing frustration, I should be able to do this. That's not a technical statement. That's an identity statement. Because hidden beneath it is another sentence, spoken or not, right? And it's a sentence many of us have spoken internally at one time or another. Okay. May not let it slip out. We may, but right. And we might not even use these words, but the feeling is there, right? And that other sentence is or could include, I'm a black belt or I'm a Shidoshi, right? I've been doing this for X number of years, right? I teach this material. I shouldn't be struggling, right? And now we've entered one of the most dangerous prisons in all of training, the prison of identity. Right? One of the things I've noticed over the years is that beginners are often more comfortable making mistakes than advanced students. And when I say advanced students, I also mean those who maybe spent years in one or more other martial arts and then came to this one, right? Or whatever one you're in currently, right? Because not all of my listeners are Bujinkan or ninjutsu people, right? But so they run into the frustration as well. Right? So, but again, beginners, I think they're way more comfortable making mistakes than advanced students. Okay, and why is that? Well, the beginner expects not to know. The beginner expects struggle, right? The beginner expects correction. But advanced practitioners sometimes carry a burden that beginners don't. Right? And that's the burden of expectation, not from others, from themselves. Okay? And when one of these deeper lessons exposes a gap, it doesn't just challenge their technique or their physical ability. It challenges their self-image. And that is where frustration begins. Not because the technique's difficult, but because reality and identity are no longer aligned. Right? And this is one of the reasons I believe many people avoid tests. Right? Why some people avoid training with higher level instructors. Why some avoid situations where their skills might be challenged. Right? Why they choose to stay in the lower realms. Right? Shoden, maybe Chuden levels, right? Convincing themselves that doing this or that technique faster, better, whatever, is really what advanced skill looks like, right? It's why some become comfortable with standards that emphasize actual proficiency rather than time served. And the number of people that have jumped ship from the Bujinkan when it was announced that there will be testing standards. And some people, if they don't look like they should when they show up for classes, may be required to retest to prove their rank. A bunch of people jump ship. And I suspect that a bunch more will. Okay. But why? Well, it's because tests don't create skill. Tests reveal the skill level. Right? They reveal So, and I tell my students this all the time, right? People show up for test night or whatever, and they're nervous and everything. And I go, look, this is a self-defense school. I've got two ways to test you on what you know. Okay. One is to do a formal test, right? Put some pressure on, not because we haven't seen you in class to know you can do the stuff, right? The point of the test is the pressure, because I need to see if you can remember your shit under pressure, which is when you're going to need it. So that's option one. Option two is I can hire 2 or 3 thugs to jump you in a fucking parking lot, and me and a couple of black belts can be behind the Chevy over there going, "Ooh, shit, we need to work on that." Huh? And then I ask them, which do you prefer? 100% so far have said they prefer test night. Go figure, right? But here's the thing. Pressure doesn't create gaps. It doesn't. It reveals them. Okay? And a lot of people don't want those things shown, right? Because, again, it's an identity thing. Okay? A higher level teacher doesn't diminish your ability. He simply helps you see more clearly, right? Where the gaps are, where the lack of coordination or whatever, right? And sometimes, more often than not, that's uncomfortable. It's very, very uncomfortable, okay? Because certainty is comfortable. Identity is comfortable. Reality, often not so much. Okay? This brings me to something Hatsumi Sensei used to talk about frequently. There's even a story here or there in books that were written along the way. Okay, statements from him. And many of you who've trained in Japan over the years probably heard some version of this discussion. Okay, but he would often talk about the difference between how many Western students and how many Japanese students viewed rank. Right? And, he'd either just make a passing comment or he'd joke about it, right? But what he saw was when a Western student received rank, that person might immediately see it as a declaration, right? An announcement, proof of who he or she now was or is, right? Perhaps even a reason to put another stripe on a belt or update a business card or hang a certificate or tell others what level they had achieved, right? But Soke would often say that a typical Japanese student reacted very differently, right? Instead of thinking, I am this level, a student would think, I'm not this level yet, right? Because what they do is they compare themselves to other instructors who have been around the same amount of time and learn, the same lessons and whatnot. And again, I know comparing yourself to others can be yeah, but Hatsumi Sensei has also said that people who've been training the same amount of time should be about the same rank level. You've had the same amount of time with the material. Okay. So, but again, in Sensei's words, right? When that Japanese student had that realization, right? I'm not at that level yet. They'd go hide in a corner and train until they were at that level because they understood something important, right? That rank was not merely recognition. It's a responsibility. And the higher the level, the higher the responsibility. Okay? And Sensei would often say that he promoted many people based on potential, not where they were, right? on what they could become, right? Think about that for a minute, right? The rank was not always a declaration of a certain level of mastery. Sometimes it was more of an invitation, right? A challenge, right? A responsibility to grow into what had been recognized. And that's a completely different mindset, right? One mindset says, I have arrived, right? And the other one says, I have work to do. One mindset protects identity, and the other one pursues growth. Right? One creates prisons, the other creates freedom. And in fact, I know this for a fact because I was told by him. Sensei sometimes promoted people faster when they weren't training the way they should have been, when they weren't practicing the skills and lessons that they were already given. He'd promote them higher. Why? Because they were chasing rank, right? Not only did he give them what they wanted, right? But by giving them the rank, he removed the excuse. Okay? The mirror became unavoidable. Okay? Meanwhile, those who were genuinely pursuing knowledge, who were training hard, who were investigating techniques and going deeper and whatnot, right? Who were focused on growth rather than recognition. These folks often received promotions much, right? Why? Because they weren't chasing rank. They were chasing understanding. And understanding has a funny way of eventually taking care of rank all by itself. Okay? Case in point was the year I was in Japan training, and I was in one of Nagato Sensei's classes. And I can't remember if it was before class or after class, but either way, he asked me my rank and when I began training. Right? I don't know why, but either way, right? And shortly thereafter, a couple of days later, in one of Soke's classes, Soke made an announcement in class that I was being promoted from Godan, from 5th Dan, to 8th Dan in a single move. Not a bell ringing thing. It was just one of those, moments, right? And again, the more I reflect on this, the more I believe one of the deepest hidden prisons in training is not fear of failure. It's fear of discovery. Right? Often people call it imposter syndrome, but imposter syndrome is, there's two forms of it. One is where somebody is more than qualified for what they're doing, but they don't think so, right? And so they're always afraid they're going to be found out, right? The other form of imposter syndrome are folks that have shit to hide and should fear being found out, but are really good at navigating those moments that would test them and that would reveal things. So there's that fear, right? That reality may reveal something we didn't know or we didn't pay attention to and should have been, right? Fear that a gap still exists, right? Fear that we may need to become a beginner again. Oh, how terrible could that be, right? Fear that there's still more to learn. Right? And we can say that we know these things, right? People do all the time. Oh, I know those things. I know I have a lot more to learn, right? I know that I have gaps and things like that, right? We can say that we know these things, But are we acting like we know them, or are we just saying we know and then continuing to ignore them? Huh? And yet, what if that's exactly where growth lives, right? What if the moment that you've just found that gap or that lack or whatever, right? What if you discover a gap isn't evidence of weakness? What if it's evidence that you've just found the doorway to the next level, right? Because that's exactly what I witnessed in Japan. Okay. Not masters proving what they already knew. And I'm talking about the senior master teachers now, right? Just little side comments, sometimes very overt, sometimes kind of had to read between the lines, right? These weren't masters proving what they already knew. I mean, there's that level of confidence and they know what they know, right? But master teachers who, even in their 70s and 80s, the youngest teacher I think we worked with was 75, I think. I'm not exactly sure about Nagato Sensei's age, but he's in his 70s. But ages that I knew, the youngest was 75. Shrei Sensei, who I've been training with for decades, right, is now 82 years old and dropping people to the ground like it's no big deal. Big old smile on his face, right? But he talked about this, right? These people still seemed willing to explore, right? Still willing to refine, still willing to discover, still willing to change, right? And if Soke and senior master teachers who've been doing this shit since the 1960s, right, are doing that, then who the hell are we to think that we can skate the process? Okay? They're not just teaching lessons; they're teaching how to be. They're teaching us how to learn, teaching us how to study, teaching us how to grow and how to progress. Right? And that realization leads directly into the next lesson from this trip. Because what I observed wasn't merely better technique. It was something much bigger. Something that points toward the evolution, right? From Budo or Budo Taijutsu to Ninpo Taijutsu to what I believe many people misunderstand about Muto-Dori Taijutsu. Right? Muto-Dori Taijutsu, for those of you who don't know, was the focus during, give or take, about the last 5 years of Soke's teaching before he retired. Okay? And again, I've been talking about this stuff. For those of you who've been keeping up with things, I've been posting articles that are kind of like Japan recap things already. But I'm going to spend a lot of time on these 3 levels because they're not separate things. Okay? 3 levels of development during spring camp as well. So anyway, here's where that evolution is, right? From Budo Taijutsu or Budo to Ninpo to, again, this Muto-Dori. And of course, each of these levels has a form of Taijutsu, but it also has a lot of other things in it as well, right? Again, before we discuss that, again, just a quick reminder, 2 weeks from now, right? Spring Camp Intensive. It's our annual, one of our annual events, June 12th to the 14th. Okay. So get all the details, register, all that kind of cool stuff, right? We've got a dojo training option. Come into town, train in the dojo, that kind of thing. Or like some folks are signed up for, you can do the virtual Zoom option, right? But either way, if you go over to onlineninjaacademy.com/spring-camp-Japan-recap, I didn't change the theme. So, I mean, I changed the theme, but I didn't change the URL. So, James, if you could pop that into the chat, that'd be awesome for people who want to check things out. If you can only do a day, if you can only do a session, whatever, just reach out, right? I can get you a registration link for that, because all that's really wired to the page right now is the full weekend thing. And the the last discount was supposed to end last night at midnight, and I didn't change it yet. So, but I will change it tonight. So anyway, save a couple of bucks if you jump onto that. And if not, no harm, no foul. We'll have a good time. Anyway, James, any questions, comments, anything from folks?
No, I don't see anything.
I'm not looking at that screen. You are. Are people still on? Like, did I drive them
Yes.
all away, or
Nope.
maybe I put them to sleep? Alan's probably sleeping. He's in his comfy chair. So he's never. Yeah, that's right, Alan. You're never going to live that down. Anyway, nope. Nope. All right. So, where can I go next with this? All right. So, I want to be careful here, okay? Because when I use terms like Budo, Ninpo, Muto-Dori Taijutsu, right? Like I said, I'm not suggesting that these are completely separate things, right? Because they're not, right? Nor am I suggesting that one replaces the other, because I'm not. As a matter of fact, I had a conversation with Shrey Sensei about these things, right? One doesn't replace the other. This is not a crapshoot where you decide, oh, I'm going to do Budo Taijutsu. I'm doing Ninpo Taijutsu. It doesn't work that way, right? These are stages of understanding. Okay, we could call them different depths within the same ocean. Okay, but after this recent trip, I found myself reflecting on how my own understanding of these ideas has evolved over the years, right? I used to be very, very adamant that we were doing Ninpo Taijutsu, right? Because that has a certain meaning to it, and there's a certain nuance. Of course, it includes Budo stuff, because you have to know the conventional stuff to be able to do this, the variation on it. And so I did recognize that, but I think for the longest time, I missed a little nuance, right? And that is that Budo Taijutsu, it's not just that it's a part of this other thing. It requires a lot of study and understanding. And that has to be developed before the Ninpo side of things can be understood in a way that we can authentically grow into it, right? And then Hatsumi Sensei using the term Muto-Dori Taijutsu, right? Or just Muto-Dori, really throws people off. I know it did me, right? Because to most people, Muto-Dori is unarmed against a sword or unarmed against a weapon, right? Or for a few folks, they understand that, at least in our art, it could be I may not be unarmed, I may have a weapon, but it's small weapon compared to his, right? The advantage is not equal. But as Mr. Say, went way beyond that. Way beyond this. As a matter of fact, for those of you who are in my coaching program, I just talked about that this past Friday for that coaching session. And again, I'll cover it again during camp. But the big mistake would be to assume that one knows because of the literal translation. But that would be an error, right? But either way, right? We've got Budo, Ninpo, Muto-Dori, Budo Taijutsu, Ninpo Taijutsu, Muto-Dori Taijutsu. they're different layers, right? They're levels of development, right? And they could roughly be translated to the Shoden, Chuden, Okuden levels in the scrolls, but not exactly, right? Anyway, but I believe that many students misunderstand that evolution, right? Or that things evolve the way they do, right? Because here in the West, we have a certain perspective on things, but that doesn't necessarily line up with the way Japanese people think. And we have to remember that this art grew out of the way they think, the way their culture is, right? Social norms, those kind of things that still exist today. Right? So, but if we think about this thing, right, and we think about the evolution of training, or we think about development, right? When most people begin training, right, their focus is, well, it's naturally physical, right, and it should be, right. They're concerned about things like, how do I move, right? How do I strike? How do I escape? How do I throw, right? How do I survive, right? How do I protect myself and others, right? And those are valid concerns, right? It's where we start everybody, okay? In fact, they're the same concerns that brought me to this art, right? As a young military police officer, a long time ago, I was 18, right? Do the math, I'm 63, right? As a young military police officer, I was not searching for enlightenment. I wasn't looking for hidden philosophical lessons. I wasn't looking for classical martial arts. As a matter of fact, my view on martial arts at the time was that shit's not going to work in today's world, okay? Because of past experience, right? But I mean, what it came down to was I wasn't interested in becoming a better version of myself, right? I wanted practical answers. I wanted skills, hard, proven, usable skills. I wanted capability, right? I wanted to know that if something happened, I could protect myself and the people around me, right? And not just because it was me, right? This is just a natural place for most people to be, right? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, right? In fact, I think most serious practitioners enter through that same doorway. Hatsumi Sensei did, right? Takuma Sensei did, right? Probably you did, right? And if I'm wrong, well, I'm talking to the guy next to you, right? But I think most of us enter that way, right? But over time, with the right focus, something interesting happens, right? Or at least it should, right? And that is that the student begins realizing that the techniques are not the destination, right? You guys know this, right? They're not, right? The techniques are examples, they're models, right? They're vehicles through which deeper principles are conveyed and can be experienced. Yeah. Okay. And eventually, if the student stays long enough, those principles begin becoming more important than the techniques themselves. Right. And this is where I think many practitioners begin moving from a more conventional understanding of Budo Taijutsu towards something deeper. Right. In all honesty, now, the students that I took with me, with the exception of Victor, my friend from Florida, who joined us on the trip, he's been around for a long time in this art. But with the exception of him, I think that most of my students, rightfully so, just went to class and trained in whatever we were working on, right? Occasionally I would lean over and go, that's in our mod 3. That's our mod 4. You recognize that from mod 1. It's just, okay, that was a Shodan to Nidan thing. It's just, he's teaching it inside out. Whatever, just little things, right? They would recognize a couple of techniques here or there, right? But it was because in most classes, most of the techniques that were being taught were either directly or indirectly, what I mean by that is variations of Kihon, right? Ichimonji no kata, Onikudaki, Muso-Dori, Musha-Dori, Gansai, and just, right? But again, I think that with correct time spent and working the process, right, many practitioners do begin moving from the more conventional, right, the Budo Taijutsu, right, toward something else, right, something deeper, right. The psychological aspects start coming in, the strategic thinking starts coming in, but not just physical whoop ass, self-defense technique kind of thing, right? Because at first, right, the question is, how do I perform the technique, right? And later, the question becomes, what principle is this technique expressing, right? The students start seeing the sanshin movements in each technique, right? They start asking the question, what makes this technique work? What allows it to work? Okay. The first, right, seeks answers, right? How do I do the technique, right? The second seeks understanding. Why does it work? What makes it work? What allows it to work the way it does? Okay. What principle is this technique using? Okay. Omote gyaku, as transitions from merely the name for an outside wrist reversal, right, or frontal wrist reversal, right, to any technique that takes him off his heels equally, both heels at the same time, right? Seizes the spine, right? Locks the feet, locks the legs, and takes him off his heels. Right? So if we borrowed that name, right, we do in my dojo, we call it Omote Gyaku principle, right? We then see Onikudaki, Musha-Dori, Osotonage. All of these things are using Omote Gyaku principle, but we're not touching the hand. We're not twisting the wrist, which is a really sucky translation. Right? So that distinction changes everything, because once the student begins seeing principles instead of techniques, the art starts expanding a lot, right? Because suddenly the same lesson, like I said, appears in multiple kata, multiple forms. The same balance relationship appears everywhere. The same timing, the same distance, the same structural weaknesses, right? The same psychological vulnerabilities, right? The same strategic opportunities, right? And the practitioner begins realizing, wait a minute, right? These aren't hundreds of separate lessons. These are a smaller number of principles being expressed through many different forms, right? And I've said that for years, right? There's only half a dozen or so principles, right? We're not trying to learn. Well, some people are, but we're not trying to learn hundreds of techniques. Keep them all straight in our head, right? We only need to master 6 to 10 principles, and we're golden. Okay? Now, we have lots of techniques to point to things, right? But that's a major breakthrough. Because now the student's no longer collecting techniques, right? Now they're discovering the structure, the architecture, right? Beneath them, what makes them work, right? Not how to do X, Y, Z, not what angle to step to, but what stepping to a specific angle based on the angle of his attack does, right? We'll just keep going here. One of the things I've taught for years is that many practitioners spend their entire martial arts career studying, the walls, the doors, the windows, right, without ever examining the foundation beneath the building, right? But the foundation is where the real lesson lives. Right? Anybody that's ever built a house or lived in a house or whatever knows that weak foundation, weak house, right? But the foundation's where everything, that's the critical stuff, right? And that realization became even more important, became more apparent during this recent trip. Because what I observed over and over and over and over again wasn't necessarily more technique, right? I mean, in one of Noguchi Sensei's classes, he said, today we're focusing on Gyokoryu. And we literally went through the Jodyaku no Maki until class ran out. Goku, Renyo, Danshu, Danshi, right? And just like all these lessons grew out of each one, but it was the same principles and concepts, not the same literal version. Okay. Because like when we did Koku, it was not the standard version that everybody knows. But if you know the actual description from the scrolls, not the convenient one that everybody passes around, right? Uke ski and then tori. Da, 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 da. That's not what the scrolls say. The scrolls say the attacker. It doesn't say uke, right? There's only like 3 maybe instances across all the Budokan lineages and all the kata, and like there's those 3 or 4 maybe are spread out across Takagi, Yoshin, and Shinden Furoryu, where the word uke is actually used to mean the person and not to receive, right? The enemy, the attacker, right, comes at your men, right, your face, this region, right? Doesn't say how. There's no written statement or implication or anything that it's ski. Those descriptions that have been passed around and people have just attached themselves to were drafted off of the original Quest videos. Somebody just typed it out. Uke does this, Tori does that. Okay. Do we use those terms? Yeah. Nagato Sensei reinforced those words. Okay, great. But the written description in the scroll doesn't say that. It says, comes at your face and you receive, right? Uke. Appropriately, right? The implication is appropriately. Not uke nagash, not uke uch, not uke dome, right? Uke. Receive. Right? Break the stars of the arm. It goes on like that. It's very vague, right? So most people are used to seeing it where there's this uke nagash and this chop on the arm, and then the kick comes, they shift to the outside, and they bunt the kick, and then they come in with Boshiken to these targets, right? Noguchi Sensei demonstrated Koku in what would look to most people like it was inside out, because he avoided the punch, uke, may or may not have actually touched the arm. Sometimes you just kind of let it touch his hand. Sometimes he let it touch and then threw it away. Sometime one of the times shifted back and then did two of these little knuckle busters, not to his knuckles, but these little pecking things to the wrist to kind of disrupt the shoulder. And then when the kick came, he shifted in a way where he just used his bent leg and the inside of his lower leg to parry the kick away from the inside, not from the outside, right? And then as the person fell, he just caught him into things or whatever, right? So he's doing things. He was following the description. Everything fit, but if you didn't know what you're looking at or looking for, or you didn't know the actual description, you might look at it and go, that's not Koku. Koku is this way. What is this senile old bastard doing? Probably not, but you might, right? So again, it became very apparent, right? Because again, what I saw over and over again, right, was not necessarily more technique. What I saw was less dependency. What I saw was less force, less effort, less collision, right? Less lockup kind of stuff, right? Less struggle. Right? I saw more in the way of relationship, timing, positioning, balance. Oh, just something that just clicked for me was the evasion and covering move actually applies pressure and balance breaking that is so light and nuanced that when it's suddenly taken away, his body has to reorganize. His body's like it's not even in survival mode. It's just like it has to reset, but it's below conscious thought. And that is the open window to catch the next move. I've been doing this art since 1980. And like that was my biggest takeaway. This little springing kind of thing that happens just because the way the body's wired. I was just so more subtlety, right? And ultimately more freedom, right? Because he's actually able to resist. He's actually able to lock up. He's actually able to do whatever the fuck he wants. But it doesn't matter because you're taking advantage of and exploiting systems already hardwired in the brain and the body that he can't do anything about. Okay? And this brings me to Muto-Dori, because that's really where this stuff was living, right? And again, you know, when most people hear Muto-Dori, right, they immediately think what? Sword defense, unarmed, right? Disarming a swordsman, surviving an armed attack, right? And I'm not overriding that. This isn't something new, right? Okay. Those things are a part of it. But they're a part of it in the Budo and Ninpo Taijutsu realms. Okay. But I believe that's, you know, most people stop there. Right. And in so doing, they miss something based on my recent experiences much deeper. Okay. Because the more I observed the Japanese teachers this year, the more I began thinking about Muto-Dori as a developmental process all on its own, right? Not merely a technical category, a developmental process. All right? Think about what that word implies, right? Without the sword, without the weapon, without the tool, without the thing you've been depending on, Muto-Dori, without blade catch. Okay? So without the blade, without the tool, whatever, right? Without the thing you've been depending on. Now, obviously, that's true literally, but what if it's also true metaphorically, right? What happens when the practitioner begins losing dependency on other things, right? What happens when a practitioner begins losing dependency on strength? Sometimes you hit an age where, guess what? You either have to work out a whole bunch more than a 20-year-old to try to keep up. You know, I know Chuck Norris died, or did he? Anyway, but, you know, until his later years, everything was about the fitness equipment and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, he was working out 3 times as much to keep up with the 20-somethings, 30-somethings, whatever. Okay? And he was fit, but muscle naturally atrophies after a certain age. Okay. But giving up dependency on strength, giving up dependency on speed. Right. I was told as a white belt in this art, I was told by Hatsumi Sensei that when you actually get this stuff right, you'll be able to slow down. You'll be able to move slower than him and still everything will work. Okay. But again, at this level, right, we're giving up dependency on youth, on athleticism, on technique, on force, on certainty. Okay. People often ask me, right? How'd you know it was going to happen? Not a clue. Wait, you didn't know that was going to work out? I mean, didn't you have a plan? Yeah, I had a plan. My plan also included the reality that I can't account for everything. Which allows me the freedom to adapt and change the plan midstream if I need to. Okay? The one thing I am certain about is that given enough time, or given whatever the variables are in the moment, I will figure it out, or I'll die trying. Okay. And last of all, one I've been hitting at quite a bit is dependency on identity. A lot of people, you know, they define themselves as whatever, right? I'm a consultant. I'm a blue collar worker. I'm a black belt in ninjutsu. I'm a whatever. Hatsumi Sensei has taught for years about being zero, which is not empty. It's complete potential to be whatever is needed in the moment. All right. And now we're entering a very different conversation. All right. Another one of the things that struck me most during this trip wasn't simply the techniques. I mean, the techniques were the techniques. I took fewer notes this time around than I have ever taken, because it was just more of the same. There were just these little nuances, right? I mean, I went to a Dai-Shihan's class, 2 of his classes, and he helped me fill in some additional blanks, because we both think the same way as far as like science and all that kind of stuff, right? And you know, he knows I have the real world experience that he wished, at least he said, he wished that more people had, to be able to know the difference between a teacher demonstrating something that is a an exercise in balance, control, timing, those kind of things, right? And not the actual thing you do on the street, and a self-defense demonstration, right? What we might call, what the Japanese call oyo, O-Y-O. It's more, it'd be written out O-U-Y-O-U, but oyo, right? Oyo means or points to like a practical application. Okay? So, but it wasn't the techniques, right? It was who was expressing them, who was teaching in the moment. Okay, Kansoke is 75, right? Talking about health issues and things like that, and was talking about being on a ladder at one point, changing a light bulb, and got dizzy and things like that. And he's talking about nature and how these things have to they have to be accounted for, right? Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, is the soke, the new soke of the Gyokushin Ryu, right? Shrei Sensei is in his 80s, right? 82. Okay? The Gato Sensei, well into later stages of life. And yet these men are still moving, still teaching, still demonstrating, right? Still expressing the art physically. Right? Now, compare that to many force-driven systems. Often by that age, if you even see 60s and 70-year-olds, okay, in the dojo, okay? But by that age, the instructor has retired from active teaching, active demonstration, right? Or younger students perform while the teacher explains or just goes around and, moves things a little bit here or there, okay? Again, there's nothing wrong with that. But what I observed in Japan was something different. Right? These men were still embodying the lessons, right? Just way more fine-tuned. And they weren't doing it through overwhelming athleticism, right? Noguchi Sensei sat down after every demonstration. Shrei Sensei, still recovering from double knee surgery, right? Definitely had a limp. Hips were a little bit stiffer. That kind of thing, right? They weren't doing it through youthful speed. They certainly weren't doing it through brute force. Okay. What I witnessed is the same thing I've been witnessing every time I go back year after year after year. Was refinement, more fine-tuning. Okay. And that observation forced me to ask a question. Right? That question was, what does an art look like after 50 or 60 years of sincere training? Because I'm almost there, right? I've been training for over 40 years in this martial art. Right? But at that point, what survives? What remains? Right? Because eventually, age taxes everything. Strength diminishes, speed declines, recovery slows, athleticism definitely changes, right? The body demands efficiency in those ages, right? Add on a whole bunch of wrecking and whatnot that done to the body through, in my case, military service, law enforcement, that kind of stuff, right? But perhaps that's exactly why these lessons become so important, right? Why it's necessary to evolve and not get stuck in some predetermined form or expression of the art. Right? Because unnecessary force becomes too expensive, literally. Right? Collision and full contact and all that kind of stuff becomes too costly. Muscling through problems becomes unreliable. Right? The practitioner must evolve. Not because they want to, because reality requires it. Reality demands it. Right? Otherwise, you be in the same place lots of people are. sitting in a fucking rocking chair, reminiscing about the days when, back in the day, I remember. That wasn't the people that I trained with. It wasn't the people that my guys trained with, that my daughter trained with. Huh? And maybe this is one of the hidden purposes behind the evolution of training. Maybe. The practitioner gradually moves from how do I overpower the problem, right? Look cool in the process. The Nagata sensei would say that, right? We'd be doing something, a lot of nuance to it and whatnot, and he'd go, good. Right? So you have energy left, right? So make it look cool. Which was really funny. Anyway, you had to be there, I guess, right? But we gradually move from how do I overpower the problem to how do I remove the conditions that make the problem possible, which was the point of the Tuesday Shinobi Kai class when I was teaching a one-handed Muso-Dori from a Shizen no Kamae. No big movements to break his balance and all that. And he could lock down as much as he wanted. It didn't matter. Right? It was like he was doing nothing. Okay? How do I remove the conditions that make that thing, that strength, that stability, whatever, that make that possible? Okay? Because that's a completely different mindset. I mean, we can see it, right? One of these people seeks victory through force, and the other seeks freedom through understanding, right? I've been teaching this for at least a decade or two, right? How do I survive? How do I do this thing with the least amount of effort, without sacrificing effectiveness, with the greatest amount of efficiency, and ultimately with the least amount of wear and tear on me in the process? Right? Because if not, right, I'm in the category of the person who's like colliding and wrestling and muscling it, right? Instead of being in the category of the other one who's influencing things, right? Because I'm long past being the one who fights the attack, right? I'm way cool with being in that level of being that guy who very subtly removes the foundation that supports his ability to be strong or to land the shot, or even if the shot lands, there's no juice behind it anymore. Right? I was moving people around. Just one of the statements that stands out from the trip was, you let him win, you help him win, right? You keep him winning until he loses. Huh? Again, as I watch these teachers move, I found myself again and again, right, coming back to the same realization, right? The deeper evolution of training isn't about becoming more forceful. It's not becoming faster. It's not becoming more proficient with the kata, right? It's about becoming less dependent on force altogether, on speed altogether, on strength altogether. Not because force is bad. Shit, if you have it, go for it. Not because strength is bad. If you have it, use it. Right? Not because athleticism is bad. Right? But because freedom is better. Because the more options you possess, the less dependent you become on any single one. Right? That's strategy. That's adaptability. And maybe that's one of the deeper lessons hidden within Muto-Dori Taijutsu itself. Right? But here's where things become really interesting, because eventually this evolution stops being merely physical. Right? The principles beneath the movement begin escaping the dojo entirely, moving outside of those walls. Right? They begin appearing in leadership. They begin appearing in relationships, in business, in decision making. Right? They begin affecting how we relate to stress or conflict, right? Life itself, right? Which brings us to what may have been my biggest breakthrough, right? Of my own journey in this art, not just this Japan trip, but in the art, right? Because what began as a search for self-protection, right, eventually became something far larger, far bigger than fighting. And I suspect that many of you listening are beginning to discover the same thing, or have already, made that breakthrough. So one of the things I've noticed over the years is that most people enter this art through a very specific doorway. Okay? Again, usually that doorway is self-protection, right? Or it's confidence, or it's preparedness, or capability, right? Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's curiosity. Sometimes it's a desire for a challenge, right? Or a new challenge, right? Sometimes it's a feeling that something is missing. But very few people walk into their first martial arts class thinking, I want a system that will fundamentally change the way I perceive the world. Probably not, right? I mean, they might join saying they are really interested in martial arts philosophy or something like that, right? But those folks are few and far in between, right? And yet, for those who stay long enough, that's often exactly what happens, right? The answer to what's the greatest benefit you've received from the training since you began? Way different. The answer is way different today than it was way back. Right? And as I mentioned earlier, right, I came to this art as a young military police officer. Right? My concerns, I assure you, were very practical. Very practical. Right? I wanted to know how to handle violence, how to protect myself, how to protect others, right? How to function under pressure. What else? How to survive dangerous situations, right? And those concerns mattered, right? They still matter. In fact, one of the reasons I continue teaching self-protection today is because violence is real. You and I both know that, right? Danger is real. Predators are real. The consequences of being unprepared are real, right? So let's not pretend otherwise. But over time, something happened that I never expected. The principles behind the physical lessons started showing up everywhere, not just in conflict, in life, right? At first, I didn't recognize it. I simply found myself making different decisions, right? I found myself approaching problems differently, thinking more strategically, that kind of stuff, right? Becoming more aware of people, right? Recognizing patterns sooner, seeing opportunities others missed. Certainly avoiding conflicts that weren't worth having, right? Because they were going to be too expensive, right? Conserving energy for battles that actually mattered. Right? In other words, the principles were no longer confined to the dojo. And I'm sure a lot of you have the same thing, right? Realize or recognize the same thing. Okay. And like me, eventually, right, realize that the same principles governing physical conflict often govern life itself. Hatsumi Sensei would often say that, right? He would teach something, he'd do something, and he would talk about it, and he would say, it's not just a good martial arts idea. It's a good life idea. Right? Shrey Sensei still says stuff like that. Right? Think about kamae. Right? Most students initially see what? They see kamae as a posture. They see it as a stance. They see it as a physical position. But eventually, you realize that kamae is also positioning, not just physical. Right? They talked about that this time, right? Psychological positioning, strategic positioning, emotional positioning. So when they say, when one of the teachers says kamae, and you look at that posture that they're in, and physically, well, that doesn't look like any of the damn postures. But the teacher's saying, always kamae. You're in kamae. They might not be talking about the physical stuff. They might be talking about awareness, right? Covering that next hand or foot, not because you put a physical barrier there, because it's your zanshin. You're paying attention to that as being a next logical option for this guy, right? You're friggin' paying attention, not to a kata choreography thing or something we want to do in our head, but we're paying attention to reality, right? Again, psychological, strategic thinking, emotional positioning, right? Emotional regulation, right? Keeping yourself cool under pressure, right? How many problems in life arise because we're standing in the wrong place mentally? How many conflicts escalate because we have adopted a poor position emotionally, right? How many opportunities disappear because we fail to establish the proper relationship before acting? Oh, if only I'd have connected with that guy sooner, I might have been on the short list, forgetting. Yeah. Right? And suddenly kamae is no longer confined to the dojo. Okay. Same thing goes for kazushi. Right? I've been talking about that for 3 episodes. Right? At first, it's what? At first, it's literal balance breaking. Mechanical imbalance, right? Breaking physical structure. But eventually you begin seeing other forms of balance. Emotional balance, psychological balance, organizational balance, strategic balance, right? You begin recognizing that many people, organizations, situations, right? They appear strong only because nobody's noticed where the support structure actually exists and how tenuous it might be. Huh? And when you know what you're looking for and you know what you're looking at, you know that when that support is removed, everything changes. Again, the lesson has escaped the dojo. Right? It's moved beyond those 4 walls. Think about my distance, timing, relationship. Right? Most students initially think in terms of what? Physical space. Okay? The physical kukan. But how many problems in life come from poor distance? Being too close, being too far away, acting too early, acting too late, failing to recognize when conditions are favorable, failing to recognize when they're not. Okay? The principle remains the same. Only the expression changes. I heard that more than once this past trip. Okay? And honestly, this may have been one of the biggest breakthroughs of my own journey. Right? Not learning more techniques, not collecting more kata, not earning another rank. Thank God I'm beyond that. Right? But realizing that the principles beneath the physical lessons could be applied almost everywhere. And that realization changed everything. because suddenly the art was no longer something I practiced. It became something I used, something I observed, something I lived, right? I wasn't practicing just physical things for the someday when I might get a chance to use it. Became something that I use virtually all the time. It went from being something that I did to being something that I can't not do, even if I wanted to. It went from being something that was external, right? Something I practiced, something I had to make time for, to something that became so much a part of who I am that, again, I can't not do it. Huh? I remember times when, the kids were younger and they were bickering or doing their little things, or they were, who knows, the mother-in-law could have been doing whatever, this manipulation shit and stuff going on, right? And I, stress would be picking up a little bit, or I'd call it out, and my wife would go, just ignore it. I can't. It's not because of an ego thing, not because, I need to be right or I need to be in control. What you're asking me to do is to flip a switch, to not pay attention to something that could affect our future 5 minutes from now, 5 days from now. No. Huh? And this is one of the things I remind my coaching students of all the time, whether they're in the dojo or they're long distance, right? I often begin a coaching session by asking, what have you been working on? Right? And many students immediately apologize, right? They'll say, I haven't had much time to train, right? You know the things, right? Work's been crazy, family needed attention, I've been busy, whatever, right? And initially, they genuinely believe they haven't been training. But then the conversation continues, right? They begin describing how they, I don't know, handled a difficult situation differently, or they recognized a pattern sooner, right? Or they applied strategic thinking to a problem, right? I remember just recently here, someone was talking about how they avoided an unnecessary conflict, right? Or they thought about a lesson from class, right? Or who knows, right? Visualized a movement, right? Instead, they didn't have time to train, so they physically train, so close their eyes between tasks at work or whatever, and visualize themselves practicing, right? Or they reflected on a concept, whatever, right? And eventually, I have to stop them and say, that is training, right? That is training. Right? It's another one of those things that people get stuck on. It's that prison of believing that if I don't have a partner, I can't train. If I don't have a place to train, I can't train. If I don't have the time. Okay? Because eventually the art is supposed to move beyond isolated physical practice. It's supposed to begin shaping perception, awareness, adaptability, right? Decision-making, judgment, right? All of it, right? Response, right? The way you move through the world, right? The dojo, I was told this from the very beginning, the dojo is the classroom. Everything outside the dojo, life, right, is the laboratory. And one of the signs that training is beginning to mature is when the lessons start appearing everywhere. That's never going to happen if somebody's only focusing on physical movement. And that the art isn't a vacuum, right? It's compartmentalized. It's over here, right? Okay. So the lessons start appearing everywhere. Not because you're forcing them to, because your perception itself is changing. And this is why I sometimes smile when students tell me they haven't been training, because very often they have. They simply haven't recognized it yet. Okay? Again, don't misunderstand me. Physical practice still matters a lot. Right? You can't visualize your way to skill. Right? You can't think your way to movement. You can't philosophize your way through a physical encounter. I mean, you can try. Fist is going to hurt, right? The body must still be trained, right? The fundamentals must still be practiced a lot. The repetitions, they still have to be, accumulated. We need the reps, right? But if all your training remains trapped inside the dojo, then something important is missing. Okay? Because the deeper purpose of Ninpo was never simply technical proficiency. The deeper purpose of Ninpo is, was, and always will be transformation. Who are we becoming because we're training? Okay? And maybe this brings us back to the prison metaphor. Right? So many people spend their lives trapped by invisible prisons. Fear, habit, identity, comfort. Nothing kills faster than comfort. Predictability, reaction. What are some of the other things we've been covering here? Past episodes. Assumption, attachment, right? The practitioner who truly begins understanding the principles beneath the physical lessons gradually, and sometimes not so gradually, becomes free from many of these things. Not perfectly, not all at once, right? But progressively. The walls become visible. And once the walls become visible, they can no longer completely control you. Okay? I think in a lot of ways, right, this may be one of the deepest purposes behind authentic training, right? Not merely being able to handle physical conflict or conflict at all, right? But becoming less controlled by the things that limit freedom itself. Because eventually the practitioner realizes something profound, I think. And that's the greatest opponent is not always standing across from you. Right? Sometimes the greatest opponent is the prison you've unknowingly built around yourself. And that realization leads directly into why I'm really excited about this year's spring camp. Because what I observed during this recent trip to Japan isn't something that can be fully understood through explanation alone. It's like most of the higher teachings, right? At some point, it has to be experienced, right? And that's exactly what we're going to be doing. Okay? So as we begin wrapping up tonight's discussion, I'd like to return to where we started, right? The idea that real training is not simply about learning more techniques. It's about becoming free. Free from fear, free from dependency, free from attachment, free from unnecessary effort, right? Free from, this is going to sound woo-woo, but I mean it. Free from the hidden prisons that quietly, subtly, directly or indirectly, right, limit perception, growth, capability, right? And honestly, this is one of the reasons that I'm jazzed about this year's camp, because what I observed during this recent Japan trip wasn't simply another collection of techniques. It certainly wasn't new kata, right? New variations here or there. Like there was a cool application that I'm going to work my ass off to be able to demonstrate during camp that Nagato Sensei did with catching a punch with a hanbo that was slick, right? But most of it wasn't that, right? It wasn't a secret scroll, right? It wasn't some hidden movement that suddenly unlocks everything, right? matter of fact, the one phrase that kept coming up from different teachers was, there's nothing hidden. There's nothing secret. There's nothing special. And when you learn that, not only do you stop looking for things like that, but you also lose a whole bunch of excuses. I can't afford it. I can't create the time. I can't. It wasn't some hidden movement, right? What I saw was a developmental process. And again, I had this conversation with Shrey Sensei about these things and how people tend to think that they can pick and choose, right? I mean, you can. It'll just delay progress because people think they can pick and choose. All they're seeing is kata. Doesn't matter if I work in Shoden or Chuden, or I used to believe that, right? But I saw a process that many students never fully understand because they're too focused on collecting answers. And even in Mikyo, we've got this understanding that enlightenment is not created by answers. It's created by questions. Not just any questions. Because the quality of the question determines the quality of the answer. And any good answer creates more questions. It's a process. Ego doesn't like those things. It wants definitive answers. It wants to think and present itself as though it knows. And that's one of the things I've noticed over the years, is that students often want to skip stages. Right? We want adaptation and henka before fundamentals. We want freedom before discipline. Right? Discipline. That's the cure for motivation. Motivation is subjective. Just don't feel motivated. Who gives a shit? Discipline trumps motivation every time. Okay. What else? We want speed before precision. Because, we need to be able to do it this way on the street. Yeah. Well, if you don't have the coordination, you're just going to be fighting like everybody else. We want resistance before understanding. Now, in that class, we jacked the resistance way up. But I was answering a question for a student. The only reason why we were doing that technique is because they said, show me something you learned in Japan. Okay. Let's start here. Now, my guys that were in Japan expected the frustration because it just carried over. But I think at least one of them could start to feel the adjustment that was happening to the body and how the strength just went away. The arm didn't get any less stiff. The muscles didn't get any less firm or strong, but it didn't matter. But we did that Muto-Dori thing because somebody said, in effect, right? Learn me something that you learned in Japan. There you go. Try this. Well, we already talked about how that went, right? But we want resistance before understanding, right? We want mastery before repetition, before we put in the reps. How many times do we need to do a technique? How many punches do we need to throw before we reach expert status or mastery level status with that particular move, with that particular technique? Okay? Science tells it's 1,000. I can hear it now. 1,000? Jesus Christ. Right? I saw that move and got it in 5. Yeah, well, there used to be a TV game show that was called Name That Tune. And of course, you won if you could do it less and less and less. But just because, right? Just because we think we have it, right? I felt that way when Hatsumi Sensei taught how to do a shooting strike with a Kasari Fundo. I was like, yeah, I got that. He's like, no, I give you 4 to 6 months to master that. I'm like, 4 to 6 months? Shit, Sensei, I got this now. And then he put up these clay tiles that they use for the, the traditional Japanese roofs, right? And he goes, oh, bam, and shattered this thing. And I'm like, that's cool. Clink. Clink. Barely putting a little ding mark on it with this 2-ounce metal fucking weight. He goes, I guess you need more time. Shit, I guess so. Because I had the basic form, but to create the power, see, I didn't go and explore that. I just felt awesome about make that weight go exactly where I want. I can hit targets with it. But there's no juice behind it. I didn't explore what it took to make that more than just a move. Okay. And unfortunately, all this being said, reality doesn't work that way. Okay. Discipline leads to freedom. Precision, especially in terms of timing, leads to the kind of speed that will stay and get better as we age and we lose muscle. Right? Not the kind of speed that the 20-somethings, we used to call them young, dumb, and full of cum. Right? What they rely on. Ones that race from red light to red light. Cost for gasoline in their cars way more than mine. Got a need for speed. Isn't that from a movie or something? Anyway, right? So the principles are already present within the basics, but the basics must be studied deeply enough for the principles to reveal themselves. All my guys remember a time that there was a moment in one of Nagato Sensei's classes, right? Black belts all around, with the exception of like my guys, I think. I don't know if there's anybody in there that didn't wear a black belt. And he had a frustrating moment. It's like the arm goes like this. It was for an Onikadaki, right? The arm goes like this. This is a basic, right? This is a basic. You know the basics. Or do you not know the basics? This is a basic. Right? So we took a moment to work a basic that everybody at that level should have fucking known. Not in their head, in their body. Go figure. Right? And one of the hidden prisons we never talked about directly during this episode is the prison of impatience. The desire to move on before we've truly arrived at the level we're supposed to be working on, right? The desire to accumulate more before we've absorbed the lessons and the stuff we already have. The desire to look advanced before we've actually become proficient. I think this is one of the reasons that so many students struggle when exposed to the deeper lessons hidden inside the Kion, because they believe they've already graduated from them. They think they already know them because they can do the moves. The Japanese teachers continually reminded me of something important. Right? The basics never stop being the basics. The basics are like the bricks in a frickin' building. They're not something that, they're not necessary evil that we have to learn so we can get on to the cool stuff. If your bricks are shitty, You can't even build them high enough to create the wall for the first floor of the building. They're going to crush under their own weight. Huh? The principles remain hidden within them regardless of rank. And every time you revisit them, you discover something new. And that's natural. It's the way it should be. Okay? So this time, what I experienced in Japan wasn't complexity. Now, I'm not saying that everybody didn't have that same experience. Right? Just talking about my own. Right? In many ways, it was the opposite. It was simplification. It was reduction, refinement, the removal of unnecessary movement. Remember I said there was that class where we were doing the Muto-Dori, and the teacher put his hand on my bicep to make sure that it stayed mushy, that it didn't fire, it didn't lump up, right? Which is a sign that I'm applying force, right? What else? Wasn't again, it was the removal of unnecessary movement, removal of unnecessary force, removal of unnecessary struggle, removal of dependency, right? And that process can be uncomfortable. Trust me, I know, right? Because every dependency we lose feels like losing something valuable. Feels like we're losing something we actually need. Why would I throw that away? Okay? Until we realize that what we've actually gained is freedom. Right? And again, that's why I believe that many students misunderstand advanced training. They imagine that advanced training means more techniques, more complexity, more information, more secrets. There's nothing secret. But the ninja, they were all about secret. Yeah, I know, but secrecy, no. They're operating, when we say they're operating in the shadows, yes, there was the overt sneaking around and shit like that, but the shadows are the gaps in perception and things like that. It's, but that's what people think advanced training means, right? But what if advanced training actually means less force, less effort, less predictability, less attachment, less dependence? What if it means more awareness, more adaptability, more perception, more freedom, right? And this is why I think what we're covering during this upcoming camp is going to be really important, right? Even if people struggle through the lessons, okay? And I mean, we're going to do things in the Budo Taijutsu realm, which should be easy for folks. In the Ninpo Taijutsu realm, same techniques, just taking them through those things, right? Be a little bit challenging, right? Because it's perception, right? And but yeah, it's going to be frustrating, right? But if we don't know what we're heading for, if we don't even at least have a glimpse of it, then we're not doing anything more than guessing our way. I guess this is the technique to do. I guess this is a good approach. I guess this is what Sensei's talking about. Okay. But not because of those things, but because we're going to spend time exploring the developmental process itself, right? The process of discovering the principles beneath the forms, the process of recognizing hidden dependencies, right? The process of learning how to create imbalance earlier. One of the things that students didn't realize until the end of that Tuesday class was that the reason they kept running into resistance is because in their attempt to apply pressure, they actually shifted their own balance and broke their own structure in a way that would not allow their body to make the technique work. But because they weren't paying attention to the bottoms of their own feet and where their balance and weight was positioned, they couldn't do anything about it. So they just applied more pressure, more force, which made the technique work less. Right? So anyway, lots of stuff. Okay. But I think a big thing that's going to come out of it is how to become aware of the prisons that may still exist without our own training. Because here's the truth, right? Every one of us has them, including me, right? The moment we think we've escaped all of them, we've probably found another one, right? And it's one of the lessons I continue learning every time I go to Japan. Okay. So anyway, let's go ahead and wrap this up. James, any questions, comments, complaints? Let me shift my screen here. I'll look at my notes. Anything?
Victor said, I found Muto-Dori Taijutsu an interesting subject.
Yeah. Apparently, Victor's not immune to jet lag either. He just told me in a message earlier today that I finally get over jet lag. Right there with you.
Gregory Leonard had checked in.
Awesome.
And United States Ninpo Academy said principles over thousands of limitless kata is the solution to many people to finally let go and accept that Kihon as the highest level. It's not learning more different things. It's more with less.
Indeed. Hatsumi Sensei said once that he could write an entire book, and he made a gesture like this on one technique. So if the Soke thinks that way, I don't know how any of us can justify thinking that we have something after doing it half a dozen times. Anyway, is that it?
And then he also just said best kuden anyone could hear, and would you go again to Japan?
Of course. We have, I don't have the date set yet, but we're going again next spring. And I already have 5 or 6 people already tentatively on the list for that trip. And I can only manage up to 8. But it would be helpful if I had somebody else going along who had been there before so that they could help me manage the group, because sometimes we have to taxi places. And while I can tell 3 taxi drivers where we're going, it'd be helpful if somebody was in the car that could go, no, not that place, this place. Because, logistically, gets around. My trips are not, my guys all know this. My trips are not the typical, I'll get you to Japan, we'll post up, and we'll eat, sleep, shit, and train in Noda. My trips follow Hatsumi Sensei's direction that there's more to the art than just the taijutsu. And so take my guys to historically relevant places, not just Japanese history, historically relevant to our lineages, everywhere we went, every place, temple, whatever. I had a prepared lesson plan. I prepared lesson for the whole thing is a teaching trip. The whole thing is a learning trip. Okay. Did we do a little bit of shopping here or there? Did we? Yeah, of course. Okay. But it's not what most people are used to. Okay. So anyway, anything else?
I think that was it.
All right, cool. Well, guys, again, another one for the history books, right? Next episode is 310, so we'll be 10% of the way to our next benchmark, although I think everyone is a benchmark at this point. Never expected to get 309 episodes into something that was, hey, let's try this out and see what happens. So, anyway, yeah. James, as always, thank you, my friend. I appreciate the help.
Mm-hmm.
I do occasionally when you're not available, but there's too much on the back end, and that always puts more delays in things. So anyway, this allows me to just kind of teach and keep on going. So, all right, guys, I'm going to wrap this up. I will talk to everybody again next time. All right. So Be safe, train hard, and I will see you next time on KUDEN.